Hi, good afternoon. This is Lee Howard with Diana T. Myers and Associates. Thanks for joining us for another COVID-19 office hours call. We are going to have sort of a different structure this afternoon with three different speakers other than myself and Lauren. You're going to hear from other folks today. And as always, we have Brendan Aumann from DCED on the call as well. So today we have, Brendan, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So today we're going to focus on talking about homeless prevention activities as related to landlord engagement and eviction prevention, specifically because I know that folks are already starting to get requests for prevention assistance in your communities with potentially inadequate resources today to address the requests that you have coming in. But also, if you're like me, fearing the quantity or number of folks who may be requesting prevention assistance once the eviction moratorium is lifted. And with that in mind, we thought it would be important to talk about things that you can do right now to either sort of start creating some conversations and programming in your community to start engaging landlords and work towards eviction prevention, or to start those conversations in advance of actual financial resources being available, etc. So we've asked three folks to present today to sort of talk about that and anything else they want to sort of throw into their presentation, but really, like I said, focusing on homeless prevention and eviction prevention efforts. We have Kirsten Marcucci, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Kirsten, who's a staff attorney from the Southwestern PA Legal Services. Their name may be familiar to you if you're in the Western PA because they partner with a lot of communities out there. And if you're anywhere in the balance of state, their organization may sound familiar because they've done our Fair Housing webinar for the last few years. So thanks for joining us. Secondly, we have Elisa Barada, Executive Director of Third Street Alliance for Women and Children, who's going to talk to us about the work that's currently underway in the Lehigh Valley. And then third, we're going to have Helen Kelly, who works with me at Diana T. Myers and Associates, who's going to be talking to you all about information, summarizing some information that's been presented by the Pennsylvania Housing Alliance and elsewhere, along with some tools that Helen used when she operated prevention and eviction prevention work programs at Wayne County Human Services, etc. So I think we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Kirsten to get started. If you are, whether you're on Skype or the phone, if you're not talking, please just make sure that you are on mute. You can either mute yourself from pushing your mute button on your phone. Please do not put us on hold though, because we'll be stuck listening to your hold music. But if you have to walk away, just put the phone down or on mute. And mute you can achieve by hitting *6. So please do that if you need to mute yourself and walk away. Thanks so much.
Hi all, my name is Kirsten. I'm a staff attorney with Southwestern Pennsylvania Legal Services. My main focus there is fair housing, so I also do a lot of landlord tenant. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about, some of the stuff that, everybody in the COC can do to try to support tenants and landlords with everything that's going on, and specifically with evictions. The first thing to know is that there is a moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent in federal properties through July 25th. And landlords aren't allowed to file the notice to quit prior to July 25th. So if they want to evict the tenant, it would have for non-payment, they haven't paid their rent now. They would have to wait till July 26th, give the 30 days, and then file with the magistrate. So it's not like it's just going to be this, okay, you didn't pay, moratorium's up, you're evicted the next day. There is going to be a waiting period. Pennsylvania, there is Tom Wolf ordered that there be a moratorium placed on all evictions like this through July 10th. There are some differing opinions on how certain counties want to deal with that, or if they are going to follow it. Based on the emails from the housing group that I'm in, it seems like some counties are just deciding that they're not going to follow them, which, I think will eventually end up, if that is the case, will end up being something that the Supreme Court does discuss. In regards to this, these are kind of our suggestions that we've been making to everyone. Programs need to check in with their clients, just see who's current on their rent and who has fallen behind. Taking a proactive approach right now could really mitigate issues down the road. And I know that there are likely landlords that just don't care. And they're not going to necessarily want to work with the tenants. I've heard, from a couple people that this is the case with some landlords in their area. That their landlord just doesn't care and isn't really willing to work with them or to do a payment plan. But at least try to take a proactive approach with those that you can. Of the people that owe rent, so gather the information on what are those circumstances. Did they lose their job because of COVID and they haven't started getting, unemployment yet? Because I know some people are struggling to get those unemployment checks. Or, did they just stop paying rent because of the moratorium and they actually do have the income to just pay it? Those are, there could be two different situations going on there. For anybody who lost income or lost their job, find out how much rent they owe and work to develop some sort of reasonable payment plan to present to the landlord. Maybe they have, say their rent's $600 and they have enough money to pay $300 a month. $300 is better than zero and will put them in a better position when the moratorium is up than owing all of that rent. Because that is, our concern. Once this moratorium is up, everybody is going to owe this back rent and people aren't going to have access to all of that money at one time. So it's better to just try to at least pay partial rent than nothing at all. For those who are just choosing, not to pay, they're like, hey, there's a moratorium, why would I pay this? Counsel them that they owe the rent and they're going to owe the rent no matter what. And making choices like that could jeopardize their housing, and they're likely going to get passed over for any available assistance in comparison to someone who has an actual economic loss. And it's also not going to look great with the magistrate if they do get evicted for non-payment of rent, and then they're sitting there in front of the magistrate and they're just like, well, I didn't feel like paying. That's a much different situation than I lost my job and I didn't have the money to pay. Make sure you're identifying the landlords and, you work with tenants to present payment plan options. And, I know that a lot of landlords have tried to be proactive about that. Just knowing that that's kind of going to be the situation, because at the end of the day, a landlord could evict one person, but they can't evict half their building if, everybody's struggling to pay rent. They can't evict all those people at the same time. You're not going to get enough people moving in. They're going to lose their income then. The other idea is, try to identify someone within your agency, that has a good relationship or, with the landlord so that they can try to act as a mediator. And then make sure you're reviewing fair housing rights and how to identify discriminatory practices. There is some concern that discriminatory practices are increasing right now, but no one's going to report it because they're so scared to lose their housing. So you don't want, so someone didn't pay rent. It could be their landlord was sexually harassing them. They kept their mouth shut because they didn't want to be evicted because they didn't have anywhere to go, especially during this pandemic. So make sure you're looking out for things like that as well. And make sure you're looking out that landlords aren't just using non-payment of rent and COVID as an excuse to, evict someone. There is any of the cases that we get, we're going to look at everything we see in the case and, try to argue that they're look at what COVID did, kind of. Even if it isn't just a non-payment of rent case, because if it is more than just non-payment of rent, they're able to act on the eviction now. And so that's not something you would want. And if a landlord could just add a random other cause to the case besides non-payment of rent, then they could act on it now. So make sure you're looking at all of those evictions with a broader lens than just, non-payment versus, some other reason like destruction of property or, they're being loud, things like that. We also have an, online assessment tool on our website to help just, if you have a client and you think they might have experienced discrimination. While a lot of the eastern counties aren't in our jurisdiction, we can always refer them to the correct program if necessary. But those are kind of our ideas right now. It's going to be hard to see where, everything falls. We don't really know the extent of the issue quite yet. So I think only time will tell. Come July, August, we'll really start to see, what's going on. But if we can get proactive and we can really start trying to get the wheels in motion for tenants who are struggling to pay, to have a payment plan, that's really the best possible situation that, any tenant could be in right now. You don't want to come to, July 11th and, the tenant hasn't paid any of their rent and they could have set up a payment plan or worked things out with the landlord, 3 months ago. But yeah, those are kind of just our suggestions on, what we can be doing right now.
Thanks very much, Kirsten.
Sure.
Anybody, before we move on to Elisa, have questions that they would like to ask? You can always put your questions in the chat or hold them to the end as well. Okay, hearing no questions, I just want to remind folks, if you are on the call and not on mute, if you will mute yourself, *6. That would be great. Thank you. Elisa, take it away. Thank you.
So can you guys see my screen?
No. Well, Lisa, this is Helen. I'm going to stop presenting.
Okay.
If you just give me a second so I could figure that out. Hold on. Did I stop presenting? Can you still see my screen?
We see it. We see Elisa's PowerPoint now, I believe.
Okay. Perfect. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Job losses due to COVID-19 are devastating is the first slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a presentation that I did for some local nonprofits that meet regularly here in the Lehigh Valley. And so we started talking about why we're doing eviction prevention, and we talked about the number of claims that were in the valley before. At the point we put it together, we didn't have April's figures, but the estimates that it could go up to 15%. And so we think that because of that, there's going to be some huge economic impact, as you all know. Low-income households are disproportionately represented. They don't have money for utilities, rent, and basic needs. Middle-income households are stretched, and landlords are struggling to pay mortgages, utility taxes, and emergency repairs. We surveyed our landlords locally, especially the landlords that we work with in rapid rehousing programs and permanent supportive housing programs, but we also sent our survey out to some realtors through the Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors Association and a couple other groups. We had landlords respond with about 3,700 units. The majority of those in Allentown, but Bethlehem, Easton, the Slapell, and other regions. Of those, 30% said tenants owe money for April's rent, and 16% of those tenants owe for more than 1 month. So we recognize that some of those that owe for more than 1 month were in the system already and weren't necessarily impacted by COVID. We asked it a whole bunch of questions about would people, the landlords, be interested in participating in an eviction conciliation process, which would include rental arrears assistance And most of them said yes. And would you participate in something that was a court appointed process? And they said yes as well. We asked them if they would be willing to participate in a similar process after sort of a return to normal, which would be around regular eviction prevention. Less than half the landlords said yes to that. So we recognize that landlords were really aware of the fact that many of their tenants are impacted by COVID-19, and they want to be supportive of that and work with us as much as possible. We're hoping as we move forward that we develop a good relationship with some of these landlords so that as we move back into the normal phase of life, that we can help prevent evictions earlier in the process. So our goal was to work with tenants to develop a plan for the repayment of arrears. Landlords can respond to these proposals without the pressure and cost associated with the entry and judgment of scheduling an eviction. We would do pre-court counseling. If it does indeed go to court because the landlord and tenant can't agree on something or the tenant can't make payments, then at the discretion, magisterial district judges could refer landlords and tenants to the counseling. That could also happen if the landlord and tenant hasn't heard about our program and goes directly to the magisterial judge to start an eviction process. The judge could at that point in time refer them to our program. And again, it's all voluntary for tenants and landlords. So there are 6 providers in the Lehigh Valley who are working on this together: Catholic Charities, Easton Area Neighborhood Center, Lehigh Conference of Churches, New Bethany Ministries, Project of Easton, and 3rd Street Alliance. We've all developed, we did a common set of trainings for case managers who are going to work on this program, did a common set of training to get them to a point where they all are going to be using the same sort of guidelines for counseling with tenants. We have looked at the Housing Alliance's Landlord Toolkit. We looked at a bunch of materials, and for about a month and a half we were back and forth on this stuff, but finally focused on the Housing Alliance's kit and some documentation that's in there that helps develop a rental repayment schedule, and we're going to work with that. So we approached the court systems in Lehigh and Northampton County to work with us on this because we wanted their buy-in early on, because we recognized that this could be a huge burden to the legal systems and the court systems. So we sent emails to the president judges of each counties requesting that they assign someone to work with us. And they did right away, and we were able to organize a conference call very quickly in this process. We started this the last week of March. We organized conference calls within a week with the teams of people they identified to work with us. And our first conference call, we got feedback on the court reps. They suggested we model the program after a mortgage conciliation process that had been put in place, I guess, in about 2008 when the financial and the banking crisis happened and there were so many mortgage problems. They also said we need to bring the magisterial district judges and the MDJ administrators into the process, and we needed to get feedback from landlords. That's one of the reasons we did that landlord survey. We also reached out to North Penn Legal Services, who works in our area around these issues, and got feedback from them on our process. We worked to identify the tools and processes that I just talked about for the eviction mitigation and conciliation process, and we held periodic conference calls with the judicial teams on a regular basis and with our providers on a regular basis. And I should step back to say, in addition to the 6 providers from Lehigh and Northampton County, we've also had United Way of the Poconos involved in some of the conference calls because they're interested in doing a process too. And so they didn't want to have to recreate the wheel, but kind of look at, can they take some of what we're doing to apply it to their area? So the last conference call we had, we were talking about putting together a training for the magisterial district judges about this and putting together materials so that they have available stuff to refer out to both tenants and landlords. So we have people's buy-in. We're looking at trying to launch that in the next week or so in terms of the training. So that's where we are in that process. So our self-referral process is a basic self-referral process that a lot of folks who do eviction prevention already use. You know, a tenant reaches out to the provider, we get documentation, we schedule an appointment because they're going to be remote for the time being. We'll be doing remote review of documents until, you know, we can be face-to-face again, help the tenant develop a budget, look at what available financial supports we can use to help pay rental arrears, craft the repayment schedule, and define any additional support, counseling, or education needs that they should be referred out to. Conference with the tenant and the landlord around the repayment plan, get documentation signed, and begin the repayment process with providers doing periodic checks with the landlord and tenant to make sure that people are comfortable with the way things are proceeding. And then finally, you know, in the court process, this is the time when the MDJ would refer the landlord and tenant to the eviction conciliation program, and they would have the discretion to grant a continuance based on the nature of the case. The tenant has to agree to move forward with the process, as does the landlord, and then we kind of go through everything that we just talked about in the other process, with the exception of the fact that at the end of the process, the conciliation agreement will go back to the MDJ, and then it will be signed off on, and the eviction will be withdrawn. So that's kind of everything in a nutshell. There was a lot more conversation that went on behind the scenes around all of this, but for brevity's sake, I'll just say that. And this is our final slide. Oh, well, here we go. Not our final slide, but we're looking at trying to get together about $500,000 per county. We're working with our Home for Good money that we have from this past year. We started to do an eviction prevention program with that money, and so we're really using that framework. We have some ESG money from the last year that we repurposed for rental assistance. We have received $20,000 from the Community Response Fund here in the Lehigh Valley. We're talking with the cities and the counties related to, you know, use of some of their CARES money to assist with this. We're looking at some home funds and some grants and private contributions. At the end result is to keep those households impacted by COVID-19 economic dislocation stably housed. So that's it in a nutshell, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have some.
Wow, you guys have been very busy. That's a lot of work that it's very clear that you guys have been doing over the last several weeks. Elisa, anybody have questions for Elisa? I guess one question that I would have is, you know, it's hard to ask because you are in the launching stages of this versus looking back to say this is what we did and these were our outcomes. But even with that in mind, for counties that are smaller, because that would be every county represented than Lehigh and Northampton, if there were one or two things that you all have done that you believe will, you know, make the greatest impact, where would you tell folks to focus their energy to develop some sort of eviction prevention process?
Well, so I would start out, I would really go back to look at the set of tools that the Housing Alliance has put together. I think that's really a fabulous tool, and it was very helpful for us. So that would be number one. Number two, I would really have conversations with folks at the county levels about what their expectation is in terms of their CARES money and how they'll be using it. Because, you know, there's prevention money in there, and I think that's critical, especially in rural communities where there has been a lot of job loss. It's a little different here in Lehigh and Northampton because we have a kind of more urban constituency, but I do think it's really important to get behind the understanding of what the counties are going for and where they see their money going, so that you can be aligned with them, or you can bring them in alignment with your plans. For people who are doing rapid rehousing and have other relationships with landlords, I'd go back to those relationships to find out, what issues they're having with their properties now and who else they talk to in terms of peers, if there are landlord networks to be in touch with. I think that's critical. One of the things that we're looking at right now is for our landlord strategy, can we identify landlords with multiple units and work with them not on a case, tenant by tenant case, but really work with them to negotiate, okay, you're owed $100,000 in rental arrears. Can we get everybody on a arrears plan, and we'll help these, tenants with a certain amount of money to help the landlord stay stabilized, but also to assist the folks who are, what would the word be, eligible for the funding availability. So that's what I would say in terms of outreach to landlords and tenants. The other thing is, get behind the Housing Alliance's legislation they are promoting with the Pennsylvania Pennsylvania Property Owners Association. I think that's what it is. The state senator, Senator Killian from Delaware County, is putting together legislation to include rental assistance money in the state budget as part of the using the state stimulus dollars, CARES dollars. And if we can get that into the budget, that's going to be a huge opportunity for everybody across the state of Pennsylvania. So if you care about this, it's organizing your own program plus getting behind the advocacy efforts to make sure the money's there.
That's great. And we can post some information on the COVID-19 workplace page about the Housing Alliance effort. I have one other question at the top of my mind. I'm hoping that other folks are thinking about their questions too. One of the things that is coming up in some communities, especially communities where there is limited housing stock, and I know that you all have limited housing stock there in the Lehigh Valley as well. I think some of the there are differences as to the reasons why in some cases, but nonetheless, a shortage of housing stock is pretty common. One of the issues, though, that we're hearing in some parts of the state is that, when folks come in to apply for prevention resources, their current housing is not up to housing quality standards. And I'm wondering if that is something that your work group has talked about, and if so, if there are any things that you are doing to mitigate that you could share with us, or if it's something that just hasn't come up yet.
So it hasn't necessarily come up around the eviction prevention stuff, but it certainly has come up when we're recruiting landlords for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So, I mean, we have folks who will kind of work with landlords and have conversations with them about what they need to do to bring their housing stock up to speed so that they can participate in these types of programs. And oftentimes that alone is enough to get them to participate. And I think that making sure the landlord knows that if their properties are sort of below standards, they won't be able to benefit from this program. And maybe get them to agree. I mean, part of the issue is, of course, right now that the money for them to invest in their properties just doesn't exist because, some people aren't paying rents right now. but it's the long-term question about low quality standards for housing rather than, can we fix this through eviction prevention? So I don't know if there's a good answer to how we help folks who are in, substandard housing.
Yeah, I have a harebrained idea that I would love to discuss with somebody who is experiencing this in their community. Helen's going to talk a little bit about the idea of service in lieu of rent. And one of the thoughts that I sort of have been having over the last few days is this idea of landlords who don't actively owe on their mortgage, or their mortgage is not a substantial amount of money, but their housing is not up to housing quality standards. Could that be some sort of service in lieu of rent opportunity to use some of the CARES Act dollars to bring that housing up to code in lieu of the rent? The tenant keeps the housing. The landlord now has a unit that meets housing quality standards, would be eligible for prevention in the future, and hopefully you could partner with for rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing in the future because their housing is up to code. If anybody wants to talk about that in more detail as a possible maneuvering of money that is coming through the CARES Act, please let me know, because I would love to figure out if something like this could be possible. So that's just my own little plug there. Anybody else have any questions for Elisa? Okay, with that, I will say, let's turn it over to Helen for her part of the presentation too. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lee. Everyone can see the slide. It's back to today's focus. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So the first thing that, let me see. Hold on. Just get rid of that. Okay, so some general guidelines to keep in mind, and actually I just want to go back, and I think pretty much everything that I'm going to present will either can be incorporated into what Kirsten had talked about and really can build upon what she had spoken about, and can be incorporated into what Elisa was talking about as well. So this can either be formalized, or something is better than nothing. So if you don't have a formal eviction program, as many people don't in the East, I think Elisa is really one of the first over in the Lehigh Valley, at least in our area out in the East. And something is better than nothing. So if you can take bits and pieces of this and implement that in your area as just informal methods, then that's great too. So if there's something that you can take away, hopefully it'll be helpful to you. The information that we're presenting comes from a combination of sources. It comes from a training that Org Code presented in a webinar format about a week or two ago. It comes from the toolkit that Elisa mentioned that the Housing Alliance put on. It comes from some resources from North Penn Legal, and it comes from just my own experience as a prevention provider. Back before I worked for Lee, I built up some programs out in the Pocono region, and just some of my experience there. So drawing from all of those resources, we did a very kind of high level overview, and then we're presenting some tools for you. So just some things to keep in mind when communicating with landlords. You'll want to reiterate this with your clients, but then also as case managers as well, to communicate clearly, often, early, and in writing. If you do just 3 of the 4, there's bound to be miscommunication. 2 of the 4, definitely there'll be miscommunication. Because if you're not communicating enough, someone is left guessing. If you're not communicating early enough, then, it's someone else is left guessing again. If it's not in writing, someone will forget what was said, or they'll just assume something. Especially now in the current crisis, landlords are going to be coming up with deals potentially left and right. And I would say more so than what they're used to in terms of augmented rental agreements and things of that nature. And it's going to be harder on them than usual to keep track of what they agree to with whom. So having it in writing really is a must. And plus, I mean, that will be easier to hold up when you go in front of the magistrate to have all those expectations in writing. But as expectations or situations change, let the landlord know. Don't keep them guessing. So if someone gets a job or they lose a job, let the landlord know that that situation changed. And something that comes up again and again in training, when you're hearing about engagement with landlords, that the two things that are really just important to them is that they want to get paid and they want to have their units filled. So if you can keep that in mind, that's kind of their mindset. It's very different than the mindset of the human service provider, who obviously wants to have their household housed, where landlords can see that, but first and foremost, usually they want to get paid and have their units filled. Okay. Okay, some homeless prevention activities, and we're going to go into these in more detail in the coming slides, so I'll just read through them quickly. But this comes from the ORCO training that happened just a week or two ago, and this is on their website too, if you had wanted to see it in more detail. But things that they suggest is explore the tenancy agreement and housing scenario, which I'll go into more detail in just a minute. Explore financial and potential support options for eviction prevention. Investigate the obstacles to staying in the current unit. In other words, identify if there's other life areas that create vulnerabilities for longer-term housing retention if the current dispute can be resolved. So just something to be aware of. Certainly, given the current crisis, many people really just do need that financial piece. They don't need a whole lot of other wraparound services, but do keep in mind that there might be some other underlying causes to the housing crisis that someone might be experiencing now. So just to be on the lookout for that. And
could I jump in for just a minute there, Helen?
Of course.
Just based on the information that Elisa mentioned that they found through their survey that went out to landlords and whatnot, they, as a reminder, what she said is that they found that some of the folks that are already behind 1 or more months in their rent are already in the system, and I think that it's going to be really important if things turn out the way that I fear, which is that the system is going to be really overwhelmed with folks seeking out eviction prevention resources. I think that as service providers, there's going to be a need to really identify which households need services and which can really just be assisted through only financial assistance, and being really smart and strategic about targeting our resources accordingly, so that the system as a whole is not completely overwhelmed. And like all services that we provide through the continuum of care, the folks who need those services the most are receiving it. That's not to say the folks that only need financial assistance don't receive that. It's just about being more strategic with our human power as well as our financial resources.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Lee. And then the last point, which we did touch on, but I'll have a couple more resources.
Helen, I don't know if it's just me, but I can't.
Does she have any income?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Helen. I know Lee was having some technical issues with Skype this morning, so I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'll go on then. And then the last point, which we did dive into this morning, but I'd have some additional resources really just to build on what was said this morning, which is accessing landlord, tenant, and/or legal services. So the first part that we're going to build on for this morning, when you're exploring the existing tenancy agreement or housing scenario, there's a couple of things that you can look at, and you're going to really want to think about how you can be creative with how the current agreement exists. And this, I think Kirsten did a really good job this morning talking about how to look at modifications. And there's things you can look at, either a reduction in payment, you can look at some kind of deferment or forgiveness. You can look at a new payment schedule, which can incorporate any of those modification options, or even just paying it in full. But are you doing perhaps split payments? So maybe you're not paying it in full on the 1st or the 5th of the month, but rather you're paying it every paycheck. So you're paying every week or every 2 weeks or whatever the case may be. And then something else that I've seen back when I was doing programming is service exchange for rent. So, I mean, if landlords are not getting rent across the board right now, they may not have money for their normal maintenance and upkeep either. So perhaps they can't pay their landscaper to come around. So perhaps someone can mow the lawn, or if that wasn't already a responsibility, perhaps they can offer to paint or whatever the case may be, either on their own property, or if the landlord has other properties, maybe they can offer to go to those other properties. Or if there's going to be turnover, they can assist if it's safe to do so, and help when there's turnover. So it's just worth having a conversation. Maybe there's a specific skill set that that person has, and they are out of work right now. Maybe they have reduced hours, but they can offer that skill set to the landlord. So it's just worth having a conversation about to see what options are out there. And when they're doing this, they're going to want to, and this actually is a quote, so it's not our language, it comes word for word from the Landlord Toolkit that the Housing Alliance came from, but they're going to create a rental payment plan with this household. And the rental payment plan is meant to provide a means to help the tenant understand, help the tenant under the existing lease agreement, meeting their financial responsibilities to the landlord in a manner agreed to by both parties. Okay, and this is a sample that is in the toolkit that the Housing Alliance created. Okay, so they have a couple of other sample templates in their toolkit, and I'll give you the link for that later on in this presentation. But you'll see it's pretty simple. I mean, and you can modify this to meet your needs, but it's reduced, it's deferred, it's forgiven. If there's, they don't really go into service in lieu of rent in here. So if you think that that's going to be an option, you can, you know, add this in. But this is just to give you an idea of what something would look like. They go into the amount of